Evening, everyone. Please be seated. It seems like it's been so long since I saw you last. Kind of missed you guys. Huh? That's actually been 3 weeks. It's always that way. But I hope everyone's having a wonderful evening this evening, and welcome to another Peaceful Solution Character Education Teacher Certification course here. We're going to continue, as you know, we are in the 7th chapter of the acceptance unit, and we're going to be picking up where our previous teacher, William, left off. In regards to these influences, okay? And this is a great chapter as we've gone through. This is our 14th chapter that we're covering so far in the Peaceful Solution. Each of these 5 units in the intermediate series has 7 chapters. So by the time we're done with this, we're going to have 35 chapters underneath our belt before we proceed to the next phase. But we're going to be picking up where William left off in the previous class. I hope everyone was able to join. If you were not, please, I encourage you to go back and rewatch the videos. You can find those on Facebook that the previous teachers brought forth, both William and Chris there, in regards to where we are in Chapter 7 here. And this is entitled, My Choices and My Future, because, of course, that's a part of the goal of what we're wanting the students to be able to understand, that they can't just bump along randomly through life and just hope for the best, or wish that they can accomplish this in life, or pump up their arms with enough confidence and they can be a superstar, a president of a Fortune 500 company or whatever. They have to understand that their future is going to be dictated by the choices that they make right now. Okay, and our goal as teachers is to get them to understand the different factors that play into the choices that they make, right? Because we as teachers know, and we want to get them to know and understand. And by this point, then we're in Chapter 7 now. If the students have been with you from the beginning up to this point, they should be able to easily discern or understand that there are choices, influences, forms of conformity, peer pressure, friends, a lot of things that fall into one of two categories, that being either positive or negative. Once they recognize that, once they're able to distinguish between the two, then they have a part of the tools, they have the tools that they need to be able to make choices that will ensure that their future is going to be a positive one, that it's going to be a beneficial one, because unless they, drop dead right then or the next day, they're going to have a future for sure, right? But we want them to understand that they can do their part, and they do have a part in making their future better, not only for themselves, but also for the society that they're involved in, that they grow up in, or that they interact with. All right, so let me just pull open the thing here, just kind of have a little bit of just little key points here from the previous class, William's class, and he talked about here some of the things that are leading up to what we're going to be covering today. Talking about the importance of gaining knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. And one of the things that was pointed out to us is that those 3 things, this knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, are being presented and are found in the Peaceful Solution in regards to us developing a positive character, right? Now, of course, this is not something that you can just set down and grasp all 3 of these concepts overnight. Yes, you can get knowledge, you can gain knowledge by reading things, right? You can get understanding, a greater amount of understanding when you start to put those concepts that you've read into practice, right? When you start to, it's like somebody telling you, or you reading about, riding a bike. I think most of us in here have ridden a bike a time or two, right? And somebody could describe to you about riding a bike and say, well, you have to step over the bike and kind of straddle it, and then you've got to push yourself a little bit to get yourself some forward momentum, and then you have to put your foot on the pedal, and then you have to start pedaling, but don't forget to hold on to the handlebars, know where your brakes are, and then you can sit down and kind of cruise and steer, and when you need to stop, either back pedal, depending on what kind of bike you have, or use the hand brakes. Sometimes people just use their feet. But it's a lot different from someone telling you that, which they've given you knowledge, they've imparted knowledge to you on how to ride the bike, versus when you go out there and sit down and start riding the bike. Now you're starting to take those principles that you were taught and put them into practice, and you're starting to see, oh, okay, I understand why I have to make sure to keep my eyes in front of me when I'm riding my bike, not looking behind me, or why I have to continue to pedal in circles. Otherwise, the bike's going to slow down and it's going to stop, right? So you start gaining this knowledge or this understanding once you put into practice the knowledge that you have, okay? The knowledge that you have. And then the wisdom comes into place when we are able to distinguish, based on what we've been taught, from the things in our environment, distinguish between what's positive and negative, and make choices that are only in the spectrum or in the category of positive. Then we're using wisdom. It's not showing wisdom by knowing what's right and doing the wrong thing. Okay? And this also classifies you when you make wise, sound choices. It also classifies you as a person of integrity. Remember, we covered that in the character unit. So, he also mentioned about, again, the true facts, getting and gaining knowledge. We must make sure that the facts that we're getting are true facts, because there's true facts and then there's false facts. And we've covered that in the previous lessons. Talked about a little bit of what an influence is and the power of influences that are brought about through movies, video games, music, and of course friends, and the influence, the power that friends have to be able to influence one another is very strong, and it can't be understated. Okay, we have to realize, because remember, we're dealing in the time period. Us as teachers have to take into consideration we're dealing with a group of young people, approximately about the age of 11 to 13, who are now really starting to seek acceptance outside the home. They're starting to kind of, as the saying goes, discover themselves, and who they are, and possibly what they want to be, things that they want to accomplish in life, things that they like and they don't like, associating with different groups of people, and so forth. And so it's important for them to be able to recognize or know what to look for in choosing a friend. But those friends and all these other influences that we name, they can play a very powerful role in the formation of one's character. And let's see here. We talked a little bit about determining the difference between positive and negative influences on page 133. And one of the it was in the, not the last class, but the previous one from last Wednesday, I believe. He said, William says, I'd like you to do an experiment. When you have time, sit down and just listen to the things in your environment, right? And how those things, because everything that we hear in our environment, it does play a role in influencing us. Sometimes it's so subtle we don't even realize it. Things that make us feel great. If you ever looked at, I remember when I used to watch, cartoons a long time ago. It was always a sign of a great morning when the person would get up and they'd get out of bed and they'd stretch and they'd step outside, and what would they be hearing? The birds chirping, butterflies flying all around and things like that, and some concerto number 5 in the background, playing, but those things are part of the environment that kind of makes you feel great. You don't even think about hearing the birds chirping in the morning, right? But when you don't hear them, it's like, where are the birds, right? I remember back in 2001, right after the 9/11 disaster that we had, and staying in Cleveland, we were the airport, Hopkins International Airport was just it was in south of Cleveland a little bit, but there was constant air traffic. In Abilene, you don't have as much air traffic. You have some, but it's not an international airport. But there was constant air traffic to the point where it became white noise. It was just kind of background noise. But I remember when they shut down air traffic, temporarily suspended it because they weren't sure what was going on and if somebody was going to hijack another plane and use it as a weapon, that it was absolutely quiet in the skies. I didn't realize how much of my environment hearing that noise from those jet engines flying overhead played a huge part. I also remember it was not too long after that we had that great blackout. It was a multi-state blackout that kind of spanned from Ohio down through several other states that were kind of on that power grid. And this was in the middle of summer. Okay, so you can imagine what's taking place in the middle of summer. You've got pool pumps running, you've got air conditioners running, you got fans running, refrigerator, all this type of noise that's taking place. And I remember stepping outside in the middle of the day, and besides for it being hot and stuffy, it was absolutely quiet. It was very, very quiet. And so, it was really odd because you're so used to hearing those things and those noises in your environment. And there's so many things that we hear in our environment, and places understand this. When you go into a mall, what do? They've got the music playing that's kind of got you in the shopping mood, right? They've got the smells from the food court. Sometimes they're not even cooking anything, but they're pumping out these smells, and you're like excited and you're wanting to get to hurry up and get your shopping done, right? You go into certain stores and there's certain smells. There's certain carpets and fabrics that they have set out and displayed to influence you to buy their products. And so, stores, they spend a lot of money and put a lot of effort into using these influences to get you to come and purchase things from their store. So again, the whole purpose is, we can't underestimate the power of influences, especially when a person doesn't or is just learning to recognize the difference between which ones are positive and negative, right? We have to be very careful and remind them, be careful to be mindful, of the things that they are allowing to influence their decision-making process. And then we also looked at how we should be leading others, not allowing ourselves to be subject to the negative peer pressure of our friends, our so-called friends, but that as they are learning the peaceful solution, they are responsible, they're accountable for the knowledge that they've gained. Now it's time for them to stand up for what's right, right? It's not always going to be easy. Even as adults, sometimes it's a difficulty or it's a challenge for us to stand up and, voice what's the moral thing to do when everybody else is wanting to do the wrong thing. Yeah? Because deep down, we all want to be accepted. We don't want to be that oddball out. But our desire to be accepted should not, as we're going to cover in this lesson today, override our ability to make great judgments. Okay, because in the end, I can tell you now, the people I went to school with, and I graduated in 1994, I haven't had any interactions with them all this time, not one. And I think most of us can probably say the same for most of the people that we went to school with. So it's like, what benefit would it be to jeopardize the development of your positive character, or jeopardize the security of a beneficial future just for a friend? Because more than likely that friend's not gonna be there in a couple years, right? They're gonna go off and do their own thing, and they probably won't even think about you. Okay, and we're gonna cover a little bit more about what a true friend is here, because I kind of chuckle at times when I hear this in interacting with a lot of young people, and they get frustrated when you're, as a parent or a teacher, kind of trying to encourage them or dissuade them from associating with certain people because of, not because you don't like them or because you think they look funny or they're from the other side of the track or anything, but because of the negative influence that they will have on your student, or your child. And so as parents and teachers, we're looking not only at the immediate person, we're not caught up into the personality of the individual, we're looking at the character and the choices that they've made. The choices that they've made over a period of time, and the reputation that they've established for themselves, that we know that because they haven't been taught the peaceful solution, and until they accept the peaceful solution and are being taught it, they're going to continue to do those things. And they're going to, like William said last time, misery loves company. They're going to influence people to do the same thing. So we want to guard our students, our children, from these things so that they don't have to suffer the consequences of being involved with the wrong crowd. And then lastly here, you have to stand up to negative influences, and you don't have to become involved with negative peers in order to learn from a wrong choice. And that was one of the last things we covered there on page 135 there. You can learn from the mistakes of others. And personally, I would much rather learn from the mistakes of others, right? I would much rather learn from, now, I don't want anybody to get hurt or anything, but a lot of, life has been going on for many, many years now, thousands of years, and many people have made these choices already. So it's beneficial and advantageous to learn from those choices that they made. So now you've kind of got a leg up. You can see, wow, okay, this is what we learned in the peaceful solution. These are the consequences if you don't follow this rule or this principle. Somebody did this, and this is the consequence that they suffered as a result of it. Yeah, I don't think I want to do that. Why? Like it was given in the example, why put yourself in harm's way when you know the outcome is going to be negative? You're not going to change a saw's ability to chop off a finger just because you're having positive thoughts, right? I'm going to just think positive and put my hand in that saw, and I'm positive that it won't cut my finger off. You're not going to change the outcome of that. The consequence is you're going to get hurt, okay? So if we learn from the mistakes of others and see what they've done from their experience, remember, experience is not always the best teacher, then we can move forward a lot faster in our character development. So we're going to get started here on Lesson Plan 7D, page Lesson Plan 7D, and we're going to pick up on Procedure 4. And it says here to the teacher, explain that the need to fit in could result in feeling pressure to do things that they wouldn't usually do. Now, this is a note for us as a teacher. When we're reading these procedures, which we should be reading beforehand, before a class even starts, going over these things over and over, familiarizing the lessons and the procedures and the concepts in our mind. What is our purpose and objective? What is it that we're wanting to implant into the student's mind during that particular lesson? But look here, it says, explain that the need to fit in could result in feeling pressure to do things that they wouldn't usually do. And if you go back to the note to the teacher here, and that's on Lesson Plan 7, page A. Oh no, and Chapter 4, I'm sorry. I wrote it right down and I didn't read it. Chapter 4's note to the teacher. The note to the teacher in Chapter 4. And that is on Lesson Plan 4, page A. Lesson Plan 4, page A. And then it just reads here, this is talking about the importance of friends and friendship, okay? Because we're talking about, what we're covering is, we're talking about how these choices and the influences that play a part in the development or making of these choices. Friends play an important role in this, okay? But on Lesson Plan 4, page A, it says, the importance of friends and friendships cannot be overstated. Neither can the need to choose friends who display moral character be minimized. So we shouldn't minimize that fact that, yes, it's very important that we have friends, and that we have friendships. But it's even more important, right? We can't minimize it, so it has to be just as great or even bigger that we choose friends who display moral character. Not just choose friends who know what moral character is, but who display it. In other words, this is being shown through their attitude and actions on a consistent basis. This is how you know what's in a person's mind and what's in a person's heart. It's through what they do, because what the desire in their heart to do is going to eventually come forth through their actions, their words, their attitudes, and so forth. Although the need for friendship is never outgrown, its significance is magnified in the lives of our children. It is at this most crucial time when they need to feel accepted by their peers that friendships matter most of all, okay? Because remember, this is a time when so many things are taking place within their bodies, with hormones and different things that are rushing through at a greater rate than they were previously in the pre-adolescent and adolescent ages, okay? And so a lot of the decisions that many young people make are not made using logic and sound moral principles. They're made based on emotions. They're made based on impulses. They're made based on the desire to be accepted and not be left out. Let's see here. Millions of children, however, lack the social skills and confidence to develop friendships that are supportive and positive. Children are often so starved for acceptance that they would rather be victimized, bullied, and made fun or made the butt of cruel jokes than face their school year without a friend. Now, in all honesty, if this is what's taking place to them, those aren't true friends. We're going to go over that again. Because friends play such an integral role in the lives of our children, it is imperative that they are taught how to recognize a true friend. Without this knowledge, children can become bullies and take advantage of others or become victims of bullying. They can also be pressured into making choices that can negatively affect them for the rest of their lives. And of course, that's what we're talking about here in chapter 7, entitled My Choices and My Future. All right, so let's go back there to that lesson plan 7, page D. So again, explain that the need to fit in could result in feeling pressured to do things they wouldn't usually do. However, exercising self-control, and that's what we're going to be talking about in this lesson today, self-control. This is the precursor as we draw this unit to a close, and it's kind of tying in what we've learned previously into the next unit that we're going to be covering, which is, of course, entitled self-control. But they're going to have to exercise self-control in their interactions and choices, which is the first step in dealing with the influence of negative peer pressure. And then you're going to have students read and discuss the section entitled Self-Control on pages 136 through 138 in their handbooks, and emphasize that careful consideration is needed to avoid poor choices. And in today's society, that's something that, I'll say can't be overstated, careful consideration, because, we live in a very fast-paced society. And I know we've mentioned this before, where everything is almost instant. You can get almost anything you want instant, or you don't have to wait for a very long time to get it. Anyway, you don't really have to even put much effort in obtaining things. You don't even have to leave your house to get groceries, or you can drive to the place and they'll bring the groceries out and put them in your vehicle for you, right? And there's so many services that, thanks to COVID, have made life even more convenient for people than they used to be. But one thing that we can't lose sight of is the necessity to use our minds, right? We've got to continue to use it. In fact, even more so now than when these books were written 20 or so years ago. Because with the advent of cell phones and tablets and touch this and touch screens that, less effort is required of the mind to do work, because it's all done for you. I mean, most of these phones are called what? Smartphones, right? They're so smart so that now we can be so stupid. That's what it seems like. And people don't tend to have the social skills that they used to have when they had to face-to-face interact with other people. So, like William said last time, the information in this book is timeless, right? Because these social skills and these how to use respect in our communication and in our interactions with others and developing friendships and having mutual respect for one another, these things, they surpass any trend or technological advancement that could be here today or, 5,000 years into the future. You're always going to need these skills to be able to interact with other people. Okay. And so consideration, that has to come forth, from the heart and mind. You have to stop and think about things. And it takes a little bit of time. People are so rush, they don't want to stop and think about it. If I can't make a decision right now, then just forget it. Or just go ahead and do this. That's wrong. Okay, well, then we'll fix it and we'll do something else. No, you've got to stop and there's nothing wrong with taking a little bit of time and considering what's the right choice. Like the old saying, you could have, if you had time to do it twice, you had time to do it once right the first time. Okay? And we would rather avoid the mistakes, avoid the pitfalls, avoid the stumbling blocks and so forth if, after obtaining this knowledge, then putting it to practice in their life and taking the time to consider how to make right choices, how to respond to someone who's being disrespectful to them, how to, accept rejection and so forth, because the outcome has to always be in bringing forth the peaceful solution. All right, so we're supposed to go over to page 137 there. Kind of got distracted in the middle. All right, so let's look at self-control there. All right, I'm sorry, 136, not 137. I apologize. We're under self-control there on page 136. We're in chapter 7 of the acceptance unit. And it's entitled self-control there. Self-control. The need to be accepted should never override. Okay, and this is what I mentioned earlier in the class. The need to be accepted should never override great judgment. Now, you read this here and you think, all right, the need to be accepted should never override great judgment. Now, remember who we're talking to. We're talking to 11 to 13-year-olds. All right. I don't know about you, but not a lot of 11, 13-year-olds tend to make great judgments. Not that they can't make any, but they need guidance, right? I know when I was 11 to 13 years old, I wouldn't be making great judgments if I was set in certain situations where there were a ton of negative influences around me, because negative influences are sometimes veiled by fun, excitement, And so it's easy to be drawn into those things because of a young person's desire to just have fun. Most young people want to have fun, right? And so, but this should never override great judgment. We're going to get into a little bit of that great judgment there. But from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, that word override, and I'm sure you've heard that used in various different applications throughout life, but it means to prevail over, also to dominate, right? You see like the new guy that comes to school and, he just dominates, over everybody in height because he's like 7'3", he must have eaten lots of Wheaties growing up. To prevail over or dominate. It also means to set aside or annul. This word annul means to make ineffective or inoperative, okay? So the need to be accepted, should never cause us to set aside our knowledge or our ability or the effort to bring about great judgments. Now, how is a person going to make great judgments, right? When you think about that word judgments there, just simply think choices, right? They're going to have to make choices, to make great choices. Well, first off, they have to be shown the difference between what's right and what's wrong. And just as a note there, that word judgment is it means the ability to judge or make a decision or form an opinion objectively, authoritatively, and wisely, especially in matters affecting action, good sense, discretion. It also means a decision or opinion about someone or something that you form after thinking carefully. All right, a decision about someone or something that you form after thinking carefully, which means it takes a little bit of time and a little bit of effort to think something out before you make a decision. And in that process, we remind them that in that process of them weighing things out, they have to gather facts unto themselves, right? Then they have to make sure that the facts that they're getting are true facts. They can't just go ask their their buddy old pal, I've known him for 10 years, I can ask him about, this or that, or building a positive character. No, you have to ask somebody who actually has authority, who's trusted, who knows, and has the reputation of practicing these positive morals, right? If I wanted to gather facts about, how to plumb a house, or if I should plumb my house with copper or PEX or PVC, I'm not going to go to a roofer, right? Because he's been roofing for 15 or 20 years, man. He's got a lot of experience. But does he have experience in what I need? Does he know the facts, the true facts based on what I need so that I can make a sound decision? No. I'm going to have to go to someone who's experienced in plumbing who can give me that information. And it's the same with developing a positive character. And so, but it should never override great judgment. In fact, oh boy, we just go back here to page 11, go back to our knowledge is power page, page 11, because whether the student realized it or not, they've been getting a lot of facts and a lot of information throughout all of these lessons, these previous 13 lessons that they've been learning, to equip them with the ability to make great judgments. Okay? All of these principles, all of these concepts, all of these examples and scenarios, they're all tools that are going into the toolbox of their mind that will help them to make great judgments. Okay? Not one tool works for every job. Sometimes you've got to pick a hammer. Sometimes you need a screwdriver. Sometimes you need an impact wrench. Okay? You've got to know which tools to draw from, and all these lessons here, they give the student every single resource that they need in order to make right choices. And then under page 11 here, it says, knowledge is power. And this one says here, well, if you look kind of to the middle of the first paragraph there, it says, well-informed people are knowledgeable about the world around them. They pay attention to influences around them, and they gather all the facts, then test and prove what is correct before making a decision. Test and prove what is correct before making a decision. Now, this doesn't mean, like we covered in the previous class, these risk-taking behaviors, like you have to go out and test, sleeping around to get an STD to prove that, yep, you get an STD when you do these things, or getting drunk and, getting alcohol poisoning is a very dangerous thing. No, the testing and proving is another step in gaining information, gaining knowledge. Okay, you don't have to prove for yourself that making bad choices bring about consequences. Remember, we can learn from the mistakes of others. And in that last, in that last paragraph, at the last sentence underneath the knowledge is power there, that second paragraph, last sentence, it says, people who are informed, remember they're gaining knowledge, they're getting all the facts, they're gathering all the facts, but people who are informed and determined to maintain a positive moral character will not jeopardize their safety, health, or their future. Here we are, my choices, my future. If we look over to page 12, just over to the next page there, and if you look there underneath that, it's under When Life Hands You Lemons, look at the second paragraph there, just underneath the lemon there. It says, when things go wrong, as they sometimes will, you have a choice in the way you handle them. You can become overwhelmed and give up. Of course, this leads to a negative attitude, depression, and feelings of helplessness. Or you can accept that the problem exists and look at it in perspective. And then we talk a little bit about what it means to look at it in perspective. If you look at that last sentence there, it says, where there is life and determination to do the right thing, there is hope. Okay? And then that last paragraph and that last sentence there, it says, do not allow life's challenges to get you down because you lose hope. Instead, let them motivate you to succeed in reaching your full moral potential. And why is that necessary for a student to learn? Because things are not always going to go their way, including their desire to be accepted by maybe a particular person or a particular group of people, right? What if that group of people, remember we covered in chapter 4 about, dealing with rejection, right? What if that particular person or group of person doesn't want them to be a part of their group or doesn't want them to be their friend? How are they going to handle that? Well, they're going to have to make some decisions. It might be some tough decisions, but they're going to have to make some decisions, because in the moment, in the heat of that moment, they're not even taking into consideration that one or two or three or four people are not the only people on the face of the earth. Like we was mentioned in the previous classes, we've got almost 8 billion people on the earth. Surely you can find a friend in one of those people. It might take a little bit of time, but surely you'll be able to find a friend. And once you go through all of these lessons, you're going to be able to find a true friend because you're going to be able to choose one. They'll be able to choose one based on compatible, positive moral characters, not solely on personality. Personality is important, but the positive character is just as important. And then on page 33 there, page 33, under make a difference, make a choice, it tells the student here, we remind the student that now that you know how damaging hatred and intolerance, as we were talking about intolerance here, are, you have a responsibility to share this knowledge with others and stand up for acceptance even when others insist on a negative attitude. Okay, if you look down to the second paragraph, paragraph, and about the second to last sentence there, or third sentence, it says, doing what is right is not always easy, and you will have to be courageous. It only takes one voice to make a difference. Let that voice be yours. Do you realize that the person being taunted could actually be a member of your own family? And this was talking about and demonstrating intolerance in regards to other people. And this is something that young people also fall into when they're wanting to be accepted by another person. Well, maybe a particular person in that group, or maybe the whole group, has a tendency to bully other people, right? So what will they do to not feel like the odd person? Well, they're going to start bullying them too. Might start off with them laughing at all the joking and the taunting that's taking place. Well, laughing is a form of acceptance of what's taking place, agreement with what's taking place. And eventually, because there's strength in numbers, they're going to start doing the same thing. Okay? But if you just kind of read for yourself, there's more information on page 49 and 52. It talks a little bit about the importance of listening and also respect in dealing with healthy communication and interactions and so forth. All these things help to build strong, positive relationships. And so, but we can't allow our desire to be accepted override all those previous lessons that we've learned, right? And tolerance and dealing with tolerance, respecting others through our communication, building healthy friendships and relationships, and so forth. They're accepting ourselves and accepting diversity. All these things have to be reiterated into the student's mind so they don't let go of these things. Now, next thing it says there, remember, you have your entire life ahead of you. You have the potential to make a difference in the world around you. And of course, from the Merriam-Webster's dictionary, that word potential means capable of becoming real. You have the potential to make a difference. Now, capable of becoming real, let me finish reading the definition here. It says, existing in possibility, capable of development into actuality. Okay, something that can actually be brought into existence through work. Okay, it's like somebody says, you have the potential to be a great speaker. Okay, in other words, it's within you. You have the ability. Well, in order for you to realize that potential, you have to go out and speak. You have to practice speaking, right? Or a great teacher, or a great artist, or a great leader in your community. Whatever the case is, that doesn't become a realization until that person puts those things into practice. And so what we're telling the student here is you have the potential to make a difference in the world. Now, as a teacher, right, this is for us, and we can remind our students if we want to, no problem with that if you have time in the class. But when I read that reminded me of the chapter in this character unit, which is character chapter 6. Let's go right there and read that for you. I'm not sure if everybody has their character units with them. chapter 6. And notice what this is entitled. I can make a difference. I can make a difference. And this is what we're reminding them. All we're doing is tying in everything we've read, we've taught our students from the very first lesson up till now. Right? The peaceful solution is a redundancy of redundancies of redundancies, to make sure that everything is reiterated so it stays fresh in the student's mind. So you have the potential to make a difference in the world around you. And then in chapter 6 on page 125 of the character unit, just read real quick here. Well, hold your spot there if you have your book. I'm going to read note to the teacher here, not the whole thing, but just the first few sentences. It says, in this chapter, students will learn that given the right motivation, encouragement, and skills, they have the potential to be leaders. Okay, given the right encouragement, motivation, and skills. The skills that they needed. Now, they have to learn these lessons in order to develop the skills. Okay, but then they also have to be encouraged to do the right thing, because it could be very easily for a person to be, swayed to something else, or maybe they're a little tired, or people are bullying me. They're saying I'm a goody two-shoe, or you're Mr. Do it right all the time, or whatever, So they have to be continually encouraged about these things and motivated in these character traits, given that they have the potential to be leaders. And of course, that's what we're striving to bring forth. As teachers, we are working to develop positive leaders for our community. Okay? Because we want tomorrow, you that are here in this room, you who are watching online, it's evident we all want tomorrow to be better than today. We want the environment for our children and those in society, whether they're here in the United States or throughout the world, it doesn't even matter. We want a better way of life for everyone. And the only way we can do that is start to educate people in moral education, positive education. You think about all the decisions that's made, whether it's in a family, whether it's on the local or federal or international level. Those decisions are made by people. And even though they have policies that they are supposed to follow in making those decisions, who writes those policies? Yeah, people write those policies. Well, what are they basing the foundation of those policies on? Is it positive moral character? Or what's in the best interest for maybe a particular group of people? Or maybe just that country, right? And this is why we see a lot of controversy when countries get together to kind of hash out deals and so forth. And, some countries feel like they're getting the raw end of the stick because it seems like this agreement is only meant to benefit one country, one side. Okay? Well, when the peaceful solution, when these concepts are taught, when these principles are valued and practiced, everybody benefits. Every single person benefits from it. Okay? And that's fair. That would be true justice. In fact, you have been teaching them how to be positive, effective leaders from the first chapter of this unit. Now, if you go over to 125 here, it says, and this is underneath, I can make a difference in the introduction. And if we look at the second paragraph, it says, whose responsibility is it to ensure a safe world for you to grow up in? Well, the truth of the matter is, your future is too important to hope that someone else will make a difference. Okay, now, granted, as students, as children, there's only so much that they can do. They can't go up into the mayor's office and say, listen, I've been learning the peaceful solution. You step aside and let me run this city. No, but there are certain things that they can do to ensure that their future, we're talking about them, their individual future, can be a beneficial, a successful one. Okay? And again, and that's what we talked about. You only have control over what you can do. And this is what the little bubble at the top says. The truth is, the only person you can change is you. And look back to that sentence there. It's up to each and every person to consistently demonstrate character skills that will result in peace between individuals, society, and the world. Let me back up there. I skipped a sentence. It says, the truth of the matter is, your future is too important to hope that someone else can make a difference or will make a difference. And as we just read there, it's up to each person to consistently demonstrate character skills that will result in peace between individuals, society, and the world. This is the only way to ensure that your future will be safe and secure for all people. All right. And then on page 127 there, on that third paragraph down under the deciding factor, it says positive leaders, on the other hand, are people of integrity. Remember, we just talked about people who internalize positive character traits, and they demonstrate it on a consistent basis through their attitude and their actions. They maintain and demonstrate their positive moral character consistently through their beliefs, attitudes, and actions. They motivate. Now, we're talking about positive leaders. We're talking about our students and what we're working to develop in them. Their capacity, they have the capacity, they have the ability as they learn this information, when they have these tools, right? Now they have the ability. Now they have to be motivated and encouraged to put these things into practice on a consistent basis. But positive leaders motivate others also to attain positive moral characters and to strive towards excellence in all areas of their lives. In addition to this, positive leaders will result in a ripple effect that will be advantageous not only to the individual, but to the society as a whole. And lastly here, let's flip over to page 130 here. It says a potential leader won't mind being trained. Okay, because we're talking about in the acceptance unit, you have the potential to make a difference. In other words, you have a potential to be a positive leader within your society. It might just start as being a positive leader within your classroom, or a positive leader within your family, or a positive leader within your community. Right? They have it. They're being fed with the resources that will help them to be a positive leader. Okay? It says here in the second paragraph, leading others requires character, personality, and skills, but to be the very best, you must develop a positive character and a harmless, helpless personality. You already know that you must maintain and develop a positive character on a daily basis. As well as for skills, well, you can learn the skills relevant to leadership in the same way you learned all of your other skills. You practice, practice, practice. And then they give a few simple steps to keep in mind in becoming a great leader. Set your mind in advance that you can be a positive leader. And that's very important. It's what we covered and what we will cover in the self-control unit, and we'll get a lot more into it about our thoughts and how positive self-talk is very, 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 very important in life, right? Because remember what we covered when we were talking about the subconscious mind in the character unit, and how the subconscious mind it's subjective, right? It takes what you plant into it, and then it produces the seed based off of that, okay? And we compared the mind to fertile soil, and that's what your mind is like. Now, if you plant corn, you're going to get corn. If you plant tomatoes, you're going to get tomatoes. If you plant weeds, you're going to get weeds. The soil doesn't go, hey, whoa, we can't grow weeds. No, the soil is just going to take what's given there, and it's going to push forth some type of a fruit. So if you plant negative thoughts in your mind, if you put negative influences in your mind, if you associate with negative people, if you give in to negative conformity and negative peer pressure, what's going to be the result? Negativity, right? You're going to develop a negative character, okay? So it's important to set your mind in advance. Yes, say to yourself, yep, I can do this. I am developing a positive character. You're not going to associate with people who do things. I'm going to stand up for what's right. I'm going to be the positive voice in the crowd. If this takes place, I'm going to use the things I've learned in the peaceful solution to make the right choice. And these things reiterate over and over in the mind, and it kicks back to you. I think most of us have heard, when we were faced with a situation, the voice of a teacher saying something, and I could hear my teacher saying this in my mind right now. Remember what I told you about doing this, or remember that you're supposed to do this, or your mother or your father or someone else that was very influential in your life, right? You can hear their voice in your head. Well, that's a positive influence, right? Well, we can do this to ourselves as well. We all have voices, right? We know what our voice sounds like. It's a very familiar sound to us, and we can repeat these things. We can write them down, or we can read them, right? And reading them out loud helps to strengthen that in our minds. When we read something and we open our mouths and speak it, now we're not only seeing it, we're hearing it as well. Okay? And so it kind of strengthens that concept in your mind. So setting your mind in advance to be a positive leader. And then value how learning to lead can help you maintain a positive character. Value how learning to lead can help you maintain a positive character. One of the things is that the leader must lead by example, right? So learning to lead will help you to build a positive character because, first of all, you're going to have to be the one who's always on your P's and Q's, right? Or P's and S's, your peaceful solutions, right? And demonstrating these positive character traits because all eyes are on you, so to speak, especially if you're in a position of a leader. And then lastly there it says, don't quit trying. Don't quit trying, right? When it gets tough and when you're having a difficult time and maybe it's one of those days or weeks or months where it seems like nothing's going your way, nothing's going the way that you planned or hoped for it to go, don't quit trying. If you fall down, get back up. Maybe go to your teacher or a trusted adult or the counselor or a parent and say, hey, listen, I'm having a very difficult time. What can I do to fix this? I'm trying to put these traits into practice, but I keep slipping and falling, right? Remember what we covered, where there's determination, there's hope. So that ties into that potential to make a difference, and every student has the potential to make a difference in the world around them. And then it continues on, it says, sometimes you might feel that if you don't go along with the crowd, you will be left standing alone. Okay, and we covered some of that in chapter 4 there. We didn't read that. Let's look to page 67 real quick. If you don't go along with the crowd, you'll be left standing alone. And this is a great opportunity to reiterate these concepts or these lessons to our students on page 67 under who, me, conform. The second paragraph there, it says, one of the most common forms of conformity is called peer pressure. Okay, and this is, like was covered, it's sometimes the pressure we put on ourselves in order to fit in or to belong. Not that somebody has to tell you, hey, come on, let's do this or that. It's the pressure that we put on ourselves in our desire to be accepted or to belong. One of the most common forms of conformity is called peer pressure. Peer pressure is when you feel like you must behave. Not when someone's forcing you to behave, but you feel like you must behave in a certain way in order for your friends to respect you or see you as an equal. Peer pressure can be either, again here notice, positive or negative. And then on page 68 there, the second paragraph, we see here some of these negative conformity here, some of the examples of negative conformity. It says, negative conformity is when you, and then it gives some examples there, are encouraged to disobey proper authority figures, compromise your safety or the safety of others, or go against moral values that you have set your mind to follow, which means they've had to be taught these things at a certain point. And in that paragraph, it says, conforming to negative moral values can result in making bad choices that could have terrible lifelong consequences. And this is important, statement here, or sentence, because that's exactly what we're talking about in this chapter. My choices, my future. Okay? And if you look in that caution bars on the very bottom there, that quote, it says, negative conformity is not the path to choose. If you follow this path, you will hit a dead end. Don't follow the crowd in doing wrong. Stand up, speak out to all with a positive voice. Stand up and speak out to all with a positive voice. And I just wanted to make a point there in that statement, don't follow the crowd in doing wrong. That's kind of a generalized statement, and usually that statement is associated with bad things. But, just to give you an example, everything could be categorized in a positive or a negative way. If you were a new person that came into this auditorium, this class for the very first time, and you sat down and you looked around you and you saw everybody with their books out, maybe a notebook and a pen and following along, would it be wrong for you to follow the crowd in that situation? No, because it's a positive thing. The key here is in doing wrong. Remember, there's positive and negative forms of conformity. Okay, so sometimes, it might be beneficial to follow the crowd if they're running out of a burning building, right? You're not going to be the one that says, no, I'm going to stand up for what? Oh, wait, no, it's hot in here, right? You're going to be wanting to follow that crowd to the exit to get out of that burning building, right? That is if they're running in the right direction. Sometimes people panic and they don't, they make very impulsive choices. So it says here, um, you feel if you don't go along with the crowd, you will be left standing alone. Well, there are people who would rather risk their health, self respect, and futures than risk losing their friends, mainly because they feel insecure about themselves. If you're ever faced with having to choose between a negative influence and doing what is morally correct, now this is a point here where we're, as teachers, when we're reading this, look at this. Now look at the rest of the font on this page. And then look at what we're getting ready to read right here. It's not only is it bold and thick and bigger than all the rest of the letters, it's given in a wavy pattern to really catch your attention. This is a very important point that we want our students to remember, to emphasize in their minds, to stand out in their minds. And, well, I'll tell you after I finish reading here. But it says, stop, think, and ask yourself the following questions. And then we're getting ready to cover and go into some of these points here. But stop, think, and ask. And I'm kind of a person, I'll try to find ways to make things stand out more in my mind, especially if I'm trying to learn them quickly. When I first started learning about the peaceful solution, and well, not really learning about it, but going and presenting the peaceful solution, I wanted to make sure that I knew the order of the books and how they were presented, because that's how we're taught. It's important to present the information in the order that it's given. And so one of the things I was having a problem with was remembering the order. So I just simply made an acronym based off of the first, few letters of the lessons, right? And with the elementary series, the beginner series, it was ORASH. That's how I remembered it. It was ORASH, which was ownership, respect, asking, self-control, and honesty. And in that way, I could remember all those books. I didn't have to guess and go, okay, which one comes in the order of this or this or that. Well, in this way, and then thinking about this is a great way to remember this. If you're ever faced with having to choose between a negative influence and doing what is morally correct, and this kind of ties into what we're getting ready to cover with self-control here, stay. Stay right where you are. Stop and think first. Just stop moving and consider everything that's going on. Okay? STAA. Stop, think, and ask. Stay. And ask yourself the following questions. And then the questions that we're going to get into are what we're going to start covering in the very next class here. But it's important that we, the self-control is something I'm telling you, we've gotten so much feedback over the years from many of the students, those who have taken the peaceful solution, whether it's court-ordered or whether they come to classes or whether they get books read them in their families, at schools, or even those who are in prison. The self-control unit is something that has been profound to many, many people, because they realized after reading this that, yes, I do have a lot of control over the outcome of my future, because I'm able to make choices that can either be beneficial to me and those in my environment or harmful to me and those in my environment. And I'm the only one who's to blame for the choices that I make. Now, a part of what they've learned is that they had to be educated, and a lot of people have been, kind of torn up because they said, nobody's ever taught me these things. If I was ever educated in the things I'm learning from this peaceful solution or the class that you're presenting to me right now, I guarantee you I wouldn't have made those choices, because I would have learned about the consequences before they came. I didn't have to experiment on my own. And this is the benefit of the prevention, which is a part of what the peaceful solution is designed to do. Prevention, prevent people from making wrong choices so that they can experience all the benefits that life has to offer without bringing any consequences to themselves or others. So we're going to pick up with stop, think, and ask on the next lesson here as we prepare for the next class, which is going to be the 26th. I believe, Sunday the 26th at 5:30 p.m. Central Standard Time. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.